I have a goatee now. If it looks stupid, let me know in the comments. Anyways, so if it hasn't been made obvious from the fact that I wear wrestling shirts in just about every video that I've made, or the fact that I have an Iron Sheik autograph right there, I'm a huge fan of professional wrestling, to the point to where I am attempting to become a wrestling historian. And of course, how does one become a wrestling historian? Through laborious study, research, and learning. And one of the ways of doing that, besides obsessive magazine and program collecting, like I have taken upon myself to do, are wrestling books, to which there are so many that I couldn't even get a whole ton of them for this video. So apologies, there are some notable ones that will be unfortunately left out, like Terry Funk's book, Mick Foley's book, Ric Flair's book, and many, many others that I have on my list. They're on my list to get and read, just sometimes prices suck. There's even the Jim Londos book that was put out like a year or two ago that I haven't been able to get. So they're on my list, I just haven't had the chance to get them or read them yet, but I have a stack of them that I am ready to go and explain and talk about and recommend. These have all been amazing books to read, so if you're a fan of professional wrestling, definitely seek these books out. But, without any further ado, let's begin. Now, of course, the first book to start with is what is considered by many wrestling historians to be the Bible of wrestling. Fall Guys, The Barnums of Bounds. Now, what I'm holding is not the original, of course. This was put out by Scott Teal of crowbarpress.com. Go to crowbarpress.com. And this was an amazing book. This was published in 1937 by Marcus Griffin. And Scott Teal did an amazing job going through this, putting this together with all kinds of pictures and all kinds of information and sources and everything, because here's the thing about Fall Guys. The original version of this is seriously flawed. Now, Marcus Griffin was a sports writer, and Toots Mondt was kind of the one that fed him a lot of the information that was put into Fall Guys, and Toots Mondt was a known liar and a con man, and had many notable enemies, including that of Lou Thesz and Nature Boy Buddy Rogers, among many others who did not trust him as a promoter. And so a lot of the information in Fall Guys here, there's a lot of half-truths, flat-out lies, and a lot of great exaggerations. There's dates that are wrong, there's events that are said to have happened that never did. Marcus Griffin grossly undersells Jim Londos, who, I don't know, is just adjusted for inflation, the biggest box office attraction in the history of professional wrestling. No big deal there. But yeah, so this annotated version that Scott Teal put out, it goes through and it corrects a lot of the stuff that Marcus Griffin put through. There's a lot of pictures in here, corroborating a lot of stuff, or just showing who's being talked about. Now, there are two things that Fall Guys is most well known for. Now, the first being that if you are to truly believe the gospel of this 100% without any of the corrections from Scott Teal, you would think that the Goldust trio of Billy Sando, Ed Strangler Lewis, and Toots Mondt were the three guys that invented wrestling, inventing the angle and the program and things like that, all the stuff that would then be metamorphosized over time to become the professional wrestling that we know now, and it would be that way for the next 70 to 80, 90 years. Now, of course, if you read this, that's not entirely the case. Yes, they had a hand in making professional wrestling like that, but the Goldust Trio were not solely responsible for it. In fact, even back to the days of Frank Gotch, there had been, angles, programs, things like that in professional wrestling. Promoters all over had their hands in kind of, helping move wrestling into that from what it was before, and thus making it a more exciting sport. Now, the other big thing that Fall Guys is well known for is for it being an expose of professional wrestling, which indeed it is. And in fact, near the end, Scott Teal pulls out a lot of newspaper articles and things that were talking about Fall Guys when it was released, being an expose of professional wrestling, but it was far from the first that many assume that it is. In fact, there were a lot of newspapers and magazine publications that were exposing wrestling well before Fall Guys, like The Ring. This right here is from 1935, back when it covered boxing and wrestling, primarily more boxing, as it would then, do boxing only as the years went on, but there was ring wrestling decades later after this. That was one of the publications that exposed wrestling a little bit, but if you really don't believe me about that, The Arena. This was a publication that was put out in the late 20s and early 30s, and it covered primarily boxing and wrestling, but it covered other sports too, baseball, hockey, football, all kinds of stuff. And this is from November 1930, that's Strangler Lewis on the cover, and if I flip it open to this page right here, it says right here, let me see, quote, You must be a good actor. You must be able to make the fans think that you are fiercely angry at your opponent at times, that you are in great agony when a hold is applied by an opponent, etc. I have often watched professional beginners overplay these parts, and it is quite humorous if you are looking for that sort of thing and recognize it when you see it. And reminder, that's 7 years before Fall Guys was published, so take that for what you will. Now, even though I spent some time here kind of talking about the things that the book got wrong, there's a lot of stuff that Marcus Griffin gets right, and to this day, Fall Guys is actually the best kind of collective timeline that we have of events, going from the days of William Muldoon all the way up to what was modern day, with stars like Londos, Shit-Cat, and many others who were the big stars of the 1930s. So if there's any book that I recommend that you seek out first if you are in any way interested in professional wrestling, get Fall Guys, but get the annotated version from Scott Teal. It's really amazing. Now, the next book that I have is Master of the Ring, the biography of Nature Boy Buddy Rogers from Tim Hornbaker, and this I thought was just incredible. This was an absolutely amazing biographical piece talking about one of the biggest stars of professional wrestling of all time, Nature Boy Buddy Rogers. Starts out with Buddy's upbringing in Camden, New Jersey, to then his humble beginnings in wrestling in the 40s, doing it at the YMCA, being trained by guys like Fred Grubmeyer, to the invention of his gimmick from Jack Pfeffer, to then going to the biggest moment of Buddy's life and his whole career, winning the NWA World's Heavyweight Championship from Pat O'Connor in 1961 in Chicago. One of my all-time favorite matches and one of the most important matches in all of professional wrestling history. And a couple years later, another big moment Buddy would be a part of, and that's becoming the inaugural WWF champion, and to which even the book then goes to talk about Buddy's health after that and about the stuff that he would do in the WWF after, to then the passing of the torch of his gimmick of Nature Boy to Ric Flair. Now, besides being written by Tim Hornbaker, this particular version was put out by Scott Teal of CrowbarPress.com. Go to CrowbarPress.com. And Scott Teal does an amazing job not only putting together everything that Tim Hornbaker had put in with pictures and everything, occasionally showing programs and things like that, but even having a whole section here in the middle showing a whole bunch of pictures of Buddy and all kinds of stuff. So really cool stuff that's in here. It's really amazing. So definitely, if you're looking for wrestling biographies, this is one of them. And of course, if you want to read some of the stuff that I'd mentioned before that I don't have, check those out too. I just haven't read them yet, but of the ones I have read, this was great. I really, really enjoyed this book. Now, of course, one thing that I do have to show that Tim Hornbaker actually mentions in Master of the Ring is this. This is a TV wrestling magazine from, I believe, 1960, 1961, I think it's 1960, with Nature Boy Buddy Rogers on the cover. And this is an amazing magazine. Just opening up the first page alone shows you a lot of the top promoters in the United States at the time, to then the rest of the magazine being chock full of great images of a lot of the guys from the time period, including like Bob Orton and Killer Kowalski and Buddy himself, Sweet Daddy Siki, among many others. It's really an amazing magazine, an amazing piece of wrestling merch. So if you can find this, it's a really cool magazine. Highly recommend this for any collection. Now, the next book is Hooker, the Autobiography of Lou Thesz. I had actually gotten this while I was waiting to get Master of the Ring, and honestly, I didn't have a whole lot of thoughts really going into it, but once I had read this from front cover to back, I thought this was incredible. Absolutely just amazing. One of the best autobiographies I have ever read. And Lou himself pulls absolutely no punches. He makes his thoughts brutally honest all throughout this book, talking openly about a lot of the promoters and even the guys that he had worked with, like Antonino Rocca, Baron Michel Leone, Ricky Dozan, Buddy Rogers, among many others. He made it clear how he wasn't exactly very trustworthy of a lot of the promoters, because the promoters were con men at the time, and about a lot of the guys how he would, let's just say, if their skills weren't up to snuff, Lou made it clear that he wasn't going to go and put them over in a big way. And that's just how Lou was as a guy. He was trained by legitimate people. George Tragos, Ray Steele, Strangler Lewis, and Ad Santel. And that combination made Lou one of the greatest, most dangerous professional wrestlers of all time. One of the most legitimate tough guys. I think just my favorite portion of Hooker right here was just Lou talking about his early life, talking about growing up in St. Louis and meeting a lot of the old timers, meeting Farmer Burns, meeting Joe Stetcher, a lot of those guys. Really incredible, and a lot of names that I had learned from Fall Guys. In fact, going back to Fall Guys, I didn't even know who a lot of the guys were. I didn't know about Farmer Burns or Earl Caddick or a lot of those old world champions, and then, here's Lou talking about meeting a lot of those guys, working with them, that kind of stuff when he was starting out in wrestling in the 30s. And that's not even everything. And this was also put out by Scott Teal of crowbarpress.com. And there's a great section here in the back about Lou's thoughts on a lot of other guys, not even connected to his main life story. Like, here's him talking about Jim Londos, talking about Tom Pax, who was the promoter before Sam Muchnick in St. Louis, talking about Jack Pfeffer, to all kinds of stuff, him talking about Joe Louis and Stanislaus Zabisco, Shopping with Freddie Blassie. So this is just another book that I highly recommend. It is just incredible. I really love this. Really check it out. Now, the next one up is The Strap, a complete history of Sam Muchnick's Missouri State Championship, written by Roger Deem and put out by Scott Teal of crowbarpress.com. In fact, I'd gotten this as a freebie from Scott. Thank you very much for that, Scott. And this is less of a biographical piece about somebody's life and more of a biographical piece about a certain belt. In fact, a belt that is considered second only to the NWA World's Heavyweight Championship, at least it was in its day. Talking about its inception and its end, and talking about a lot of the guys who had held the belt, including the inaugural champion of Harley Race, to other guys that held it like Bob Backlund and Kerry Von Erich and Jerry Blackwell and Ric Flair and many, many others. It was a very prestigious belt in its time. Now, this book does things a little bit differently, going over a lot of the attendance figures at the Kiel Auditorium and wrestling at the Chase TV in the episodes, and how long the matches went for, and a lot of the backstage stories that were going on at the time with a lot of the guys. In fact, it pulls a lot of excerpts from Ric Flair's book and Harley Race's book, Jack Briscoe's book, and many others. There's a lot of stuff from Larry Matisick all throughout this. It's really an incredible look into not only the Missouri State Championship itself, but also just the later years of the St. Louis territory. Once Sam Muchnick had kind of stepped away from the NWA, was focusing solely on St. Louis, to then his eventual retirement, fully at, in the beginning of 1982, to then other guys taking over the book, and things going downhill from there as St. Louis as a territory started to then resemble the Kansas City territory, which in its time was a fantastic territory. But when St. Louis started to resemble that, a lot of the fans were turned away because they were worlds apart in terms of presentation. And then once Vince McMahon had gotten the TV time, it was pretty much over. But this was an amazing read, and I'm a sucker for anything statistic heavy that's in professional wrestling, so having a book like this that goes over all these attendance figures and all of these, great matches and everything, telling you what happened in all of them and the moves that were used and everything, you can visualize it all in your head really great. It was just absolutely incredible. So definitely, I recommend The Strap hardcore. Now, the last couple books that I have are quite different from the aforementioned ones, as these are not biographical or autobiographical or anything. These instead were books that were put out when wrestling was starting to get really hot on network television in the early 50s. And the first book that I have for that is The Wrestling Scene by Guy LeBeau, at least LeBeau, one of those. And this book right here, I got courtesy of wrestling historian and author Bob Bryla. Thank you very much, Bob. And this is an incredible book. This was put out in 1950. And it goes over talking about a lot of the guys who were there at that current time wrestling, like Baron Michelle Leone and Lou Thesz and Antonino Rocca and Gene Stanley, Primo Carnera, who was also a boxer in the 30s. It's really just a great who's who in wrestling. That is one of the chapters in here. And it even does a fantastic job going over the events of wrestling that had happened about 20 years prior, talking about guys like Londos and Lewis, John Pasek, Joe Stetcher, all those guys. So definitely, if you can get your hands on this, it's an amazing read. And in the same vein of The Wrestling Scene, there is also The Wrestling Fans book. This was put out in 1953, I believe. This is the second edition. I don't have the first edition, unfortunately. 1953. And this is in the same vein as The Wrestling Scene and the first edition that was put out before this, a year prior, by the same author. And it does a fantastic job going over all the current stuff going on in professional wrestling. There's stuff in here of ladies wrestling. There's Henry DeGlane, who was the victor in the original Montreal Screwjob, was awarded the belt via disqualification. There's stuff, again, like The Wrestling Scene, talking about the guys of 20 years prior. It even has a list in here of the 6 greatest wrestlers of all time. And it even has a part here in the back with statistics on all your favorite wrestlers in alphabetical order, too. So it's really just an amazing book all around. Same with The Wrestling Scene. If you can find these books, they're really quite the hot commodity, and they're fantastic to just go over and read. And I pull them out from time to time to kind of freshen up on my 50s wrestling knowledge, and it's just chock full of just so much great information on all the guys who were around at the time in wrestling. It's just incredible. So I definitely recommend this one and The Wrestling Scene too. Well, thank you for watching. I just wanted to go over all these books. I've read these over the course of the last year or so, and they've all been just amazing reads. So I recommend every single one of them if you can get your hands on any of them. And of course, there's going to be a part 2 to this once I get my hands on more wrestling books, which I definitely will at some point. I just need to find ones with proper prices, and I need to go through my list to see which ones interest me the most. So there will be a second part to this. But that's about it for this video. Farewell and stay well.